6 years old, like every other 6-year-old, all I could think about was chocolate chip cookies. I wanted to live in a chocolate chip cookie house. I wanted to eat them endlessly. But most importantly, I wanted to bake my own chocolate chip cookies. Now that was a problem, you see, because my parents, being parents, obviously thought it was too dangerous for me, a little clumsy 6-year-old, to use the kitchen oven. But I needed to bake my own chocolate chip cookies. So what did I do? I built my own homemade solar-powered oven out of cardboard and aluminum foil, and I baked my own chocolate chip cookies. Granted, they tasted nothing like the real ones, but to me, they tasted like heaven. When I was 9, my family shifted countries. I was older, and I wanted my room to myself. The only problem was that room looked like this. My parents were always on my case saying, clean up your room, it looks like a pigsty. To be fair, it did. But I wanted to just keep them out of my room. So how did I solve that problem? I built this, a homemade burglar alarm connected to the room door so that every time someone tried to enter the room, this really annoying alarm would go off, and no one knew how to switch it off. The next day, I came back home from school, and the alarm was still going off because mom had tried to enter the room. After that, my parents didn't dare to come into my room until they broke the alarm. So why am I telling you these stories? Well, because these tell you who I am. So who am I? I'm a maker, hacker, and tinkerer at heart. I've always been a kid with the knack to find the wackiest solutions to all sorts of problems. Granted, those problems haven't always been the most pressing social issues. Let me tell you another story. When I was 14, I had another problem, obviously the problem of annoying parents. Every time I'd leave my room without switching off the lights or fans, I'd be reminded by my dad, you know, electricity costs around here. You're not the one who pays bills. So if you were a normal 14-year-old, what would you do? Switch off the lights and fans, right? But if you're me, then you build your own home automation system with a computer chip that is voice and sensor controlled and switches off all the lights and fans for you automatically. This is what you get. Turn on the light.
Turning light on.
Turn on Spotify.
Here you go.
Turn on the sensors.
Sensor mode on.
And this actually had an actual use. A bunch of my mother's friends wanted to buy this for their own rebellious teens' rooms. And that's when I figured that the things I create can fulfill bigger needs than just my own. They can solve other people's problems as well. Over the past few years of designing and tinkering with some crazy little gadgets, I've explored what design means to me, and I'd like to share that with you. Firstly, to me, design is all about creating solutions. 2 years ago, I was very surprised when one of my friends unexpectedly dropped out of school. He was hard of hearing, and it was extremely difficult to communicate with him. I wanted to understand why he left, and he told me, it's impossible to understand anyone in school. What's the point of coming to school when I can't understand my friends or my teachers? Naturally, this was a big problem, right? A problem that was forcing someone to drop out of school, and I wanted to find a solution. So at first I asked him, why don't you just get some hearing aids? That was an insensitive question. He said, my family can't afford a decent pair of hearing aids. But I searched online, and I wanted to find a solution, and I found these mobile applications that could convert speech to text and basically give you captions in real time. So I said, why don't you use one of these apps? He said, I've already tried using these apps, and they're just extremely inconvenient. I don't want to always have to look at a phone screen. I wouldn't be confident in school or in public. I realized there was no solution that he could actually afford that was convenient. So I decided to build something myself. Over the past 2 years, I've designed and developed TranscribeGlass, an affordable, assistive smart glass for the deaf and hard of hearing that captions conversations in real time on a heads-up display. I love solving problems. Problems, to me, are actually not problems. They're just solutions waiting to be found. It's like a treasure hunt, and that treasure hunt is essential to what design is for me. Secondly, I've realized that you've always got to look closer. You've got to notice the minute details, and you've got to do something about those minute details. Design is about seeing the invisible problem, not just the obvious one. So in my case, the obvious problem was that a deaf or hard of hearing person couldn't understand others. But why were existing solutions inadequate? To answer that, I had to look closer. My friend said that hearing aids were too expensive. Looking closer, I found that the average hearing aid in India costs 90,000 rupees to 3 lakhs, whereas the average deaf person earns just 20,000 rupees a year. These solutions were 5 to 10 times the income of people who needed them. That sucks. But I wasn't satisfied with why he wouldn't use a mobile app. He said it's inconvenient. But that was an easy solution. So looking closer, I found that there's actually a Mehrabian model according to which 93% of all communication is nonverbal. So when you're communicating with someone, their lip reading, their facial expressions, their hand gestures, their body language, that is very essential to understanding what they're saying. Add to that, for someone with auditory loss, they depend heavily on visual cues to add context to communication. I now understood why he said it was inconvenient. Not only was he always having to look down at a phone screen, but he was actually just getting 7% of communication and was missing out on all those important visual cues that was essential to understand what other people were saying. So, what has really kept me going in this journey? To me, it's the belief that what I create can make an impact. Here's another story. About a year ago, I had spent 2 weeks nonstop creating a new prototype of the device. I was soldering parts together, I was creating the electronics in 2 weeks nonstop, and I finally had a prototype, and I laid down on my table, and just then, Mom walks into the room. Hey, what's this cool thing you do? She picks it up, and before I could say anything, the device falls. Its guts are spilled everywhere. And the worst part was, I had to test the very same prototype with real users the next morning. At that point, exhausted and frustrated, I said, why am I even doing this? Is this even going to help anyone anywhere? I contemplated just calling it a day. Until the email. Titled A Wish Come True, it was from a complete stranger who was deaf and was eager to test my prototype. His words touched me. Hi, master problem solver. Thanks to God for sending you in this world. My faith is again restored now. I latched on to these words as I went back to the drawing board. I designed a new prototype, again, 2 weeks on end, and I finally had a ready prototype. And I distinctly remember the look on the very same man's face when I gave him TranscribeGlass. He smiled because he could understand what I was saying to him. You see, for me, design is not just about creating cool things. The maximum satisfaction I get is when the things I create can transform somebody else's life, when you solve other people's problems. And that's the most powerful effect of design for me, making an impact, whether it's evoking emotions, putting a smile on a passerby's face, causing the audience to self-introspect, or just making someone's everyday life a little bit easier. Designytra's theme this year is on the contrary. Design owes itself to contrarian thinking, people who have etched new paths. And that journey really resonates with me and my journey. How many of you have ever tried building a hardware device? It's really tough. In software, new prototypes take just hours. You can change a line of code and you have a new prototype. In hardware, it takes months. And how many of you have tried building a hardware device in India? Well, that's even harder, because the DIY culture and maker ecosystem is still evolving. Now, imagine you're doing all of that as a 16, 17-year-old, where teachers are breathing down your neck, asking about your grades, where potential investors are always telling you that you're too young and you're too inexperienced, where grants aren't accessible to you. People say that you need a degree to build a product, and no one seems to take you seriously. Now, imagine you're doing all of that for a community, the deaf community, that is so disenfranchised and underserved that they're at the margins of society. There are barely any startups in the deaf space because it's not sexy to work in the deaf space. There's no money in the deaf space. Imagine going to a meetup where there are several hundreds of people, all of them deaf, and you are the only odd one out because you are the only one who does not know sign language. Let me tell you, that's not fun. These were all the challenges I was facing, and by doing so, I was completely going against the flow. How many of you here have heard of the idea of moonshot? Moonshot, in a technology context, is an ambitious, exploratory, groundbreaking project that is undertaken without any expectation of near-term profitability or benefit, and perhaps without a full investigation of the potential risks. It's basically an out-of-this-world idea so crazy that it might just work. Moonshot is not about thinking out of the box. Moonshot is about demolishing the box. Let me give you an example. Summer of 2014, my exams had just ended. All I wanted to do was get away from my books and play outdoors. At the neighborhood park, I accidentally shot a football perfectly into a trash can 50 meters away. Two onlookers, thinking I did that on purpose, started applauding. And that's when this brilliant idea struck me. Why not try these crazy, near-impossible trick shots, throwing balls into buckets from 100 meters away, toppling markers with frisbees from 50 meters away, and film these and create some content? Here starts my craziest journey. I called up a bunch of friends. We spent hours on end, sometimes half a day, trying these insane trick shots. You know, the easiest one took 15 tries, the hardest probably 463 tries over 18 hours. And it's an art, because first you have to imagine an impossible trick shot, then you have to frame it, then you have to set up the cameras at the perfect angles, then you have to edit it, then you have to put the jump cuts, the slow motion, and the music, and finally you have this.
Make the ground shake.
So all of these ideas are what technology, innovation, and design mean to me. But most importantly, I think design is about people, about humans, the way people interact with objects, the way users interact with creations, the way viewers respond to images or film. Design at its core is human. I remember a story. One of my mentors, who was a professor at IIT Delhi, told me. So he had built this affordable assistive device for blind people. It was a smart cane that could help them navigate. He had built a prototype of the device, and it was just this plain white stick. And he went to test the prototype with real blind people. Now, the first thing every blind user asked their friend after they tested the device was, "What color is this device?" And when the friend replied, "It's just white," the blind user asked the professor, "Why is it white? Why can't you make it neon orange or a cool green design?" The professor was confused. Why would you care about the color? The blind person took offense. Just because I'm blind, does that mean the color doesn't matter? I may want to use a nice, colorful, aesthetically pleasing product, even though I may not be able to see it. And that right there is the nuances and layers to human nature that design or technology can never predict. Until you give your creation and your designs to real users, you never know what to expect. About a year ago, I'd finished creating one of the prototypes and was taking it to the National Association of the Deaf. That's when I realized that great design is all about seeing through the eyes of the user. I pitched the prototype to Anuj, the secretary at the association. It was this affordable assistive smart glass for the hearing impaired. And that's where came my first learning. Anuj took offense when I said the word hearing impaired. I thought it was the politically correct way. It was rude to call someone deaf. But he actually explained to me that, no, being deaf is our identity. It's not an impairment. The second learning came when I asked Anuj, okay, so why don't the deaf just use cochlear implants? They're these surgical devices that just give you full hearing ability. Isn't that the perfect solution? And he said, no. Maybe full hearing ability is not what we want. We are deaf. Why do I have to change myself to integrate into mainstream society? I don't want to strip myself of my identity by getting a surgery. People who'd created cochlear implants would have thought that deaf people would have jumped at this product, at the idea of having full hearing ability. But that's just not how it works. My third learning came when I showed him my prototype. His first feedback, he tested it out, and his first initial response was, okay, it's really cool, but it's very big and heavy and clunky. Can you make it more inconspicuous? What? Why would he care about how big or clunky it is? Isn't the tech cool? Look at what it can do. It's so cool. And the answer to that question was really straightforward, but something I couldn't see unless I looked through the eyes of a deaf person. He told me, being deaf is my personal identity. I may not want everyone out there on the street to immediately know I'm deaf. This device screams deaf to me because it's huge and it's big, and people will instantly label me as that. That's not what I want. So how many of you here have heard of the Google Glass? It was this revolutionary piece of tech in 2013 that came out, and I was in love with it, right? It was an inspiration for me. My mouth was watering at the ability to wear a computer on your face. But it actually failed in 2015. Now, the first reason it failed was, surprise, surprise, not everyone is as geeky as me with their mouth watering at wearing a computer. Instead, people thought it was awkward, unattractive, ugly. Who wants to wear this big device that screams, I am a geeky nerd? Right? Now, the second reason it failed was Google Glass wasn't really solving a specific problem. It was just this really cool piece of tech, and people didn't know what to use it for. It didn't have a specific use case. And the third reason it failed was because people, humans, were not comfortable with wearing cameras on their faces. It was a privacy concern. You could be sitting in a bus and the person opposite you is recording your every movement. That's creepy. And that right there is the perfect example of what I mean. Design is about humans, about understanding people, the way people would interact with an object in society, and it's also about solving human problems. To me, design and technology without people is pointless. And that brings me to my last point. For me, design is about empathy. If you look in a dictionary at what does empathy mean, you'll see that it's the ability to imagine what someone is feeling like and so understand his or her problems. But after interacting with the deaf and hard of hearing community, I've really learned that empathy means to be able to walk in another person's shoes. It's not advising the deaf or hard of hearing to get a cochlear implant and change their identity. And it's not feeling sorry for them because they can't integrate into mainstream society. Empathy is when you become the other. And in doing so, you equip them with the best tools to integrate into mainstream society while keeping their own dignity and their own identity intact. To me, technology and design that does not integrate empathy into its core is pointless. And without that empathy, your own chocolate chip cookies will never taste as good. Thank you.